So I want to thank everybody again for joining us. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can join us live in these discussions. You can click the link in the description, join the London Ayn Rand meetup, and we have 3 of these every week on Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday. Yeah, as anybody who's ever been to a big sporting event or entertainment event knows, there's nothing like being there live. So. I hope you will join us live for the next one. For everybody here, if you want to see the recording of this or any of the other discussions, they are on our YouTube channel. I'll post the link in the chat. So our topic today is fighting for ideas in times of crisis. And that title begs quite a few questions. One is which ideas are you fighting for? There are some ideas that you may not want to fight for, even when it's not a time of crisis. Then the question of what it means to fight for ideas and what it means, again, in different contexts. And that leads into the crisis part, which is we are obviously talking about the current crisis, but it's always good to ask questions, ask to what extent it is a crisis, which aspects of it are basically the crisis. Is it's obviously there's the health aspect, there is the economic free fall, there's the government measures. So we will be discussing all the different aspects of that. And by the way, on the point of crisis, you should always ask, is it a crisis? I think that even before this, we had the housing crisis, we have the climate crisis, we have a bunch of different crises at any given time, and ideas do matter in this. And so for this topic, we have the best panel we could possibly have. So we have Claire Fox, who is the director of the Academy of Ideas that organizes the Battle of Ideas every year in London and satellite events elsewhere. I highly recommend coming to the Battle of Ideas. It'll hopefully take place in the autumn this year. We will hopefully be back to normal then. And we also have Nikos Sotirakopoulos, who joins us regularly, and he is a Marxist turned objectivist. So his own inner battle of ideas is something that we can all learn from. And yeah, and I'm not just saying that because my side won that battle of ideas, but because it shows that you can always even as a lecturer in a university, when you've held the same ideas for your entire life, you can always challenge them and see that maybe you were wrong. So with that, we'll start with Nikos.
Thanks a lot, Raji. So there are two popular narratives out there nowadays about the crisis, and I want to talk a bit about them. I'll be short because I'm looking forward mostly to the discussion. So the one idea was perfectly summarized by someone who is a prominent member of the so-called intellectual dark web. And I'm not picking up specifically on that person because I otherwise appreciate that person, but she wrote something on Twitter, which I think is very, very interesting. So this is a tweet from a couple of weeks ago. So the tweet says, "In good times, I am a centrist libertarian, but in hard times, I am pragmatic. Whether it is the nationalization of utilities, Keynesian stimulus, quarantines, and surveillance, if it works, do it. Scale it back later." So why this tweet made such an impression in me? And maybe we can have a discussion about whether it would be okay for the government to take some special measures in times of crisis. But notice the deeper meaning of this post. Supposedly, it's the world of ideas here, which is for normal times. And in a crisis, we switch to being pragmatic. So there's these two different, let's say, modes of operation. Normal times, ideas and principles. Crisis, we're pragmatic. And I think this is a profound misunderstanding of what ideas and principles are. And it makes it sound as if ideas are basically a hobby that you do on the weekends. Or maybe ideas are this fancy suit or this fancy dress that you wear on a weekend party, and then on Monday you hang it back in the closet. But this is not what ideas and principles are, because actually they are the guidelines that tell you how to live life. And if we take it to the level of, let's say, political science or political ideas, they tell you how society prospers. And they apply even more in a time of crisis. I mean, take, for example, this crisis and the idea of freedom and its opposite, the idea of coercion. And think of how better off we are today than, let's say, a month ago, in terms of how much we know about the virus and how many tests, for example, are done, and how we see how many people are coming up with new tests or with new initiatives on how to provide masks, or see how the supermarkets, for example, manage to find solutions so that we keep the social distancing, or to filling the gaps in their shelves. And think about how disastrous coercion has been proven, whether in terms of suppressing vital information, or delaying tests, or rejecting tests, or rejecting the production of masks based on some stupid bureaucratic or regulatory reasons. So I think in times of crisis, we need to stand up for ideas even more. And since this is the Ayn Rand meetup, Ayn Rand said that courage actually means keeping your integrity under fire. So if we say that when the things get tough, I throw my shield away, as we say in Greece, and I run, then two things could be happening. Either I'm not taking the idea of ideas seriously, or my ideas are not good enough. Because if I have to throw away my ideas when things get tough, I should really start asking some question about these ideas. And the second thing I want to challenge is not really an idea, it's mostly a practice, and it's the practice of groupthink. And it's the moral outrage that any deviation to this groupthink brings upon. And for a lack of a better word, I almost see the rise of a new type of person, of a new type of character during a crisis. So the Soviets talk about a new Soviet man, or the Homo Sovieticus. And I would say we almost see this narrative about this new Homo coronavirus. So this is the type of character who unfortunately is not an active citizen. This is a type of person that should basically shut up. And there are only a few exceptions when you should not shut up. So they are telling us you should shut up unless you have to parrot these things that I really doubt how many actually understand what they mean. Things like flatten the curve or exponential growth, you can talk about that. Or you can post like social media hashtags, stay at home and things like that. And maybe once every week at a specific time, you can go to your balcony, or whatever is the equivalent of balconies in this country, and you can clap for the NHS. But this is where the agency of this new ideal citizen ends. And this is what groupthink is telling us. And I think this is very, very, very dangerous. And when we see such a rise of groupthink, it means that it's exactly the period where we have to fight this groupthink with some other ideas, or at least question these ideas. And don't fall for the blackmail that says, you are not a scientist, therefore shut up. First of all, most of the people who parrot these platitudes are not scientists. And even among the scientific community, we see people fighting all the time. And this is how good science works. You have people who are free to express disagreements and to express positions that might even be wrong. But the productive thing to do is discuss these things. See, who of the science is right? Is it the science who says, for example, that herd immunity works? Or is it the science who says herd immunity is not a good idea, for example? But whoever brings this opposite view, I've even seen the term treason thrown around. I mean, there's a very famous TV pundit who posted a picture of some people having like some time in the park and said treason. And I thought, treason, that's very weird. Like, you see this term usually in very dark times. And calling someone a traitor basically means there's only one official line, and any deviation from this line, it means this is like the utter moral condemnation. And I have to say, this creeps me out, because I can imagine these people in different times falling 100% for the then groupthink and the then allowable opinion, which usually does not end well. So we've had times, for example, where the allowable opinion was some of the darkest practices or moments in human history. So we have to be very vigilant with that. So my message here is not that I know better than the doctors, or that I'm not even saying that the lockdown is necessarily wrong. And actually, I decided to work from home many days before the government forced me to do so. But my message is simply that in difficult times, our ideas and principles are even more useful than ever. And again, if they're proven unworthy, then maybe we should rethink them. And actually, Razi joked about how I've changed my views throughout my life. I changed my views during the financial crisis, because I realized that the ideas that I had would not work. And if they cannot work on a crisis, then they're not good ideas. And the second thing that I want to kind of point out is that, as I said, quite often the majority is wrong. And quite often even the experts are wrong. We've seen it with the financial crisis of 2008. We've seen it with the war in Iraq. So that's why we should be actually encouraged to ask difficult questions, even if we, at the end, we're proven wrong. And I think that's the role of anyone who wants to call themselves an intellectual. And actually, I'm really glad that I see that some of them, like the panel we had last week, and also my co-panels today, that they're doing exactly this. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikos. Claire.
So that was really useful. I want to raise some problems about what it feels like to be an intellectual in this time, and where I struggle. So I'm sharing with you, because I think that this is an international health crisis, and it can be really frustrating when decision making appears to be in the hands of scientific and medical expertise, and those of us who have ideas are pretty much shunted to the sidelines. Now, there's some reasons with this, which is, as the blurb for this session indicated, we do lack crucial information and technical knowledge. I cannot intelligently discuss a virus or epidemiology or any of the different scientific and technical theories that are put forward in terms of stopping the spread of the virus. I can read around on it, and I do read around on it, but I'm doing it as an amateur, trying to get to grips with it. So to a certain extent, one feels as though you're disempowered by the situation that we're in, which is that what we face, or one of the key things that we face, is the coronavirus. How we respond to it, of course, is a whole different question, because that is to us as citizens. But nonetheless, there is this disadvantage of not being the technical expert. The problem then is that we have to make decisions based on judgments, and making our own judgments about whether we think the advice of that technical expertise is correct or not. So I'm less of the opinion, for example, that we should see the lockdown as a principled or denial of freedom. The point that Nikos made about whether him accepting the lockdown or working from home or whatever, you kind of make a decision, and in that sense, that is a pragmatic decision. But I suppose it's also a conscious one, and the greatest fear for me is that you can consciously say to the state, I consent that the loss of freedom might be temporary, and I give you consent for it. But that's not the same as abandoning all understanding of what a free society is. And those people who then say you should never be concerned about civil liberties or overreaction by the police or anything, shut up, go along with it. That would completely miss the point. But nonetheless, in some ways, I recognize that pragmatic point, the quote that Nikos made from the well-known person who I know who it is, and you think, oh, that is shocking, and yet in some ways maybe I'm doing the same because I'm going along with a certain amount of this based on my judgment. But the problem I've got is I don't know whether my judgment is correct because I'm trying to listen to the scientific and medical experts about the spread of a virus that I don't understand, if that makes any sense. The other another issue that I'm struggling with, I'm actually raising all the problems I've got with this rather than kind of straightforwardly what I think about ideas. I, I've always had the motto, question everything, on the word of no one, investigate, be an independent agent of my own intellectual life. Don't go along with the herd in exactly the way that Nikos said. But I also have become incredibly irritated by a different kind of groupthink, which is to believe nothing that anyone in the government says, and a complete cynicism about, it's almost like, and the epitome of it for me are those terrible press conferences every day and the behavior of the media, which is, it doesn't matter what anyone says, they're going to say, if they say black, the media say white. It's almost a kind of childish, cynical, I don't believe you, a kind of a contrarian punditry that feels to me as though it or poses itself as a kind of ideas-led, we're the ones who are holding these people to account, we're driven by challenging ideas, not just nodding along, and yet somehow it doesn't feel as though it's in good faith. It feels, and it gets on everybody's nerves as well, because it kind of creates this sort of blame game atmosphere. So one of the difficulties about being somebody who is usually associated with challenging mainstream narrative is how not to get into that kind of cynical querying of everything for the sake of it almost, and how you kind of distinguish yourself from that. And you will know that a lot of people who also purport to put themselves forwards as kind of, we're the ones with the different ideas, the new ideas, a kind of questioning approach, end up being, how to put it, conspiratorial nutcases. I mean, the number of people who say to me, I've got a really good idea of what we should discuss at the Battle of Ideas. I mean, not people I know, but people on social media, and I know that you'll appreciate this because you don't go along with the pack, but I've got a theory. There's nothing worse when they say that. I've got a theory. I've got a thesis, you know what I mean? And people are familiar with the 5G thesis, but, there's 1,020,000 of them, aren't there? And, people are kind of contacting me on Facebook groups, on WhatsApp groups, and all the rest of it with the most outlandish, ridiculous, mad, completely dreamt up theories about where this virus came from, what's driving it. I mean, it's great having an imagination, but they, as it were, that's associated almost with the realm of ideas again. It's almost like they're the people with the ideas. They're not the herd. They don't go along with groupthink, but on the other hand, they're fruitcakes and nutcakes. How do we deal with that? I've got another problem with dissent. I am absolutely terrified by the attacks on anyone who dissent. I know you maybe discussed this last week, but it terrifies me that because Peter, what's his name? God, I can't remember his name. Peter, anyway, you know what I mean. Hitchens, thank you. Peter Hitchens, has become one of the highest profile dissenters, to a certain extent. Brendan O'Neill, who you had on last week. There's other people who are kind of really challenging the mainstream narrative. The intolerance of those people, it seems to me, is pretty scary and conformist and so on and so forth. But it's just how does one be a dissenter today other than to be a kind of from the sidelines complainant? And that's what gets me. I saw an example of a group of youth in London who all had balaclavas and were singing a kind of rap song as they smashed up a school, which was along the lines of, fuck the lockdown, fuck the virus, fuck Boris Johnson, completely nihilistic, destructive. They weren't going to be held back by the lockdown. They were going out and physically defying it. And that was at one extreme. But of course, I was thinking, for God's sake, lock them up. No, but you know what I mean? I wasn't admiring of their dissent. And there are people I know, whereas I think it's greatly exaggerated, this idea of all these people going out defying the lockdown. I mean, to a certain extent, I don't necessarily want everyone to go out and defy the lockdown. So it's quite a tricky one, right? So I want people to appreciate freedom. I want them to be thinking on for themselves. I don't want people going up saying, oh, fuck it, I can't be asked. You know what I mean? I mean, there has to be some sense in which we have a responsible, now I hate saying the word responsible, sense of what we believe to be right. So how do we be grown up about ideas in this way? That's what I'm trying to say, is a lot of the what passes for dissenting ideas or challenging the orthodoxy or challenging the status quo actually can be an immature cry of rage, a nihilistic backlash. And therefore, for me, I'm trying to balance a kind of sensible regard for for challenging what is I consider to be the groupthink that Nikos explained so well, and sticking with our own principles, and not getting that muddled up with this kind of wider kind of scream of discontent. Obviously, grown-up ideas about the virus that we face, not how we react to it, but about the virus we face, indicates that we don't know what the answer is, and that no one does, because it's a new virus. So part of the grown-up response in the world of ideas and philosophy is to recognize with some humility that we don't know what the answer is to this, and a sense of certainty is not appropriate, and that we maybe need to learn more. And that's why it can be so inspiring when you see big scientific breakthroughs happening or what have you. We've got to recognize as well that there is massive disputes amongst all the scientists and the evidence, as Nikos already has indicated. But also, I do think it's important to distinguish between science, which is important in solving a medical virus after all, but on the other hand, the judgments that are required in terms of how we react to that virus, and for example, when we would go out of the lockdown, or at what point we make decisions about the balances of what's been lost in terms of the destruction of the economy and so on, they are political judgments. And that is when we need to draw upon and call upon the philosophy and ideas and principles that we all struggle with daily, but the things that we hold dear to, that we try and work it out within a framework of philosophical ideas that we are committed to, even though we might all have different versions of that. And that dispute, that battle of ideas, is crucial for moving forward. So it might not all be epidemiologists, but we can all really attack ferociously, as it were, the battle of ideas to work out what we do next and how we deal with it. And also, the more creative aspect of that, which is exciting, is it's only if we maintain our commitment to our ideas and our philosophy and our imagination about the future, and locating this present moment in the context of the past and the future, that we can actually come up with some of the practical solutions that will solve the problem anyway. Because it's only through an open-minded, creative approach to this that, for example, we might be able to find an antidote to the virus. We'll find ways of making machines that we need for hospitals and so on and so forth. Those things are actually the creative use of philosophy and ideas applied in terms of a technological progress. And so we can appreciate them in that, but also in terms of an intellectual breakthrough, because we are going to have to rebuild the society that we leave lockdown from, because no doubt about it, this had a shockwaves across the world, and it will have massive implications. But how we deal with that, it seems to me, is very important. My final thought is just that, and it does seem reasonable to say, is most of the trends that we have witnessed in the debates about the coronavirus, it seems to me, are ideas we're all familiar with. They were there as trends anyway. And anti-humanism already existed around, often around environmentalism, or certainly the kind of Extinction Rebellion, a kind of despondency and misanthropy was already there, and then it kind of comes to the fore. A kind of distrust of people and not believing that it can be trusted to make their own decisions, therefore the state's got to make the decisions for them, which are those people clamoring for the lockdown to be made compulsory rather than to a certain extent voluntary, as it's semi-voluntary at the moment. That comes from a distrust of people's agency, etc., etc., etc. So a lot of the, and even the ideas about how to solve the economic problems and the use of the state is not a new idea. These are kind of things that were already happening and in the ether that are just now coming to the fore. So in that sense, we don't have to be frightened that there's a whole load of new ideas that we don't recognize and we can't locate ourselves around them, but to apply what we already know to the new situation as we try and untangle our way through it.
Thank you, Claire. And before we go to the Q&A, let me remind everybody, if you have a question or a comment, please use the raise hand function. You can do that at any point. You'll get automatically placed in the queue, and we'll come to you when it's your turn. Claire, I want to pick up on the point on dissent. So as you mentioned, much of this, we've seen it before. You can't really ask questions, certain questions in regarding climate change, and there are, I guess it's not exactly the same, but there is a lot of vitriol generally in political discourse. Do you see it getting worse, or is it worse now? And how do you think the way this crisis is being discussed will affect the battle of ideas going forward?
Can I just clarify? You mean you're not allowed to dissent normally, and is it going to get worse? That's what you said, yeah?
Well, I mean, yeah, in certain matters of consensus, dissent is very, very strongly rejected. And yeah, I'm wondering how this is going to affect ideas going forward at all, because consensus builds over time, sometimes pretty quickly. And what will happen to those who don't join it?
So what I'm going to say, it's completely half-baked. Actually, I plan to build it to a proposal for a Battle of Ideas panel. But it seems to me there's almost two different kind of senses of, not sense of life, so it's almost predictable who will say what so it was predictable with Brexit, it was predictable with Trump. It's less predictable now. So I have to say I have been disappointed by some people and impressed by people that I didn't expect. But I think it has to do with your overall look at life, your overall vision of life, right? So as you mentioned, if you are one of the people who, for example, can't wait to make the point that humanity needs to pay for its sins, and I'm talking about the secular version, or if you are a conservative nutter who thinks that globalization has always been like a horrible thing and now we are paying the price, as if in 1918 it was globalization that kind of caused the disaster. So I think the thing which is worse now is that for the first time it's real. The fear is real. So I don't think people were really scared about Brexit, but now they are actually scared. And I'm scared. Again, I'm not playing the tough guy. So when you add to this, when you add this actual fear to the culture wars, I think it gets worse. Because now if I disagree with you, it's not that I will live under, quote, Trump's fascist regime because of you. It's that I'm going to die because of you. Or maybe my beloved ones are going to die because of you. And because you're outside in the park, then my relative with a compromised immune system might die. So now it becomes even more personal. So it's this general trend. And now you add the fear to it, and it becomes much worse. So, but what will it leave behind? I don't know. I'm not sure. Because I don't want to make an optimist prediction like on record, but I will. I wouldn't be surprised if 8 months from now, people are going to tell you, well, yes, I've overplayed this maybe a bit because I wanted you to be afraid. And you should thank me because of my overreaction, we saved X amounts of life. I mean, let's hope that we reach that point. And yeah, if they say it, I'm happy, to pay the price if we find ourselves in that world. But I wouldn't be surprised for that. So I don't know what are the scars that it will leave in the culture wars or the political wars or the culture battle of ideas wars.
Thanks. And by the way, I love the live pitch for a Battle of Ideas panel, Nikos. That's great for ratings. Claire.
I largely agree with that. The thing that's really, the life and death thing gives it a certain edge, let's be honest. And people I agree that people are frightened. They're actually frightened for themselves, but they are frightened for their loved ones as well. And it does feel like, I mean, you know, this is not an original point, but having cried wolf constantly about crises around whether it was no deal Brexit or the obesity epidemic or any number of these things, suddenly there's a real bloody epidemic and there's a real crisis, and you know, you're not making, it's not made up, right? It's not a figment of anyone, despite a few conspiratorial people thinking that it isn't. But what I think makes dissent harder and why it's is these emotive things, like you're going to kill people if you carry on doing this, if you argue. And we've got to make the distinction between making an argument for freedom, which is not the same as going around a park spitting in old people's faces so that they die, right? I mean, that's kind of like, there's a kind of merger. The other thing that's driving me mad at the moment is the use of NHS workers in particular as the kind of heroines or heroes of this story. Now, I'm not trying to take away from the fact that if you work in hospital, it's pretty grim. But if you make a dissenting comment, somebody will send you a meme of a nurse crying, having just come out of a COVID ward, having seen people die. And this is kind of meant to shut you up and shame you. And it's like there's good people. What are you doing? You know, you're doing nothing. And then the final thought, I mean, I'm not answering any of this, as I didn't even answer the question in the first place, because I think this is interesting times and we should raise these problems. This is definitely not clear cut about who thinks what about anything, right? There's no Brexit Remain divide. I think people who are trying to say there's a class divide are missing the point completely. I just don't think it's like that. Just an observation a colleague made, because I think it's worth noting, is a lot of working class Leave voters, for those of you who I know who I'm talking about, are very much in the stay at home, don't be irresponsible brigade, because they see it as their agency as responsible citizens to not be stupid. And they think a lot of the people going out, as somebody put it to me, skateboarding around the park or doing yoga or Pilates, they think the people who are being irresponsible in the park are a kind of middle class prats who won't stop, who are self-indulgent. And I'm mentioning that because it's sometimes being posed at the moment as though there's kind of lots of middle class do-gooders going around shouting at ordinary working class people getting out of their overcrowded flats in London. But it just isn't as simple as that. It's just not as black and white as that. People have got very different reactions to it. It's certainly the case that a lot of people who I would have anticipated would at least be worried about the encroachment of liberty of something like the COVID bill. I mean, that piece of legislation, when I objected to it, people were sort of along the lines of, oh, you and your stupid, politically correct civil liberties. And these are people who are kind of associated with the freedom side. I'm like, oh. And even questioning it was kind of dismissed as a sort of indulgence of the worst order. This is far too serious for you and your intellectual arguments type thing. And even today, in one of my endless rows on social media, somebody said to me, I love your battle of ideas, Claire. I love the fact that you argue back, but now is not the time. You know what I mean? Now, shut up, go away. Now is not the time. And it makes you gulp, because although I know now is exactly the time, I myself think when people are being overly self-indulgent in their reaction against some of the government policies, that I think now is not the time. So I get confused.
Thanks, Claire. And so our first live question is from Eamon. You are unmuted now.
So I would like to get your comments on the fact that Parliament is missing in action. That do you think this is contributing to the climate of conformity? Is this something that do you see this changing soon? Are they going to? Because it seems to me like that is a big contributor to this idea that we're all in this together, so shut up and do as you're told, because everyone agrees.
I think it was colleagues at the Full Brexit who wrote an article who said that by Parliament standing down, they'd admitted that they were non-essential workers. And to a certain extent, there was a truth to that, which was they said, oh, well, we can't, it's only essential people should go to work, key workers, so we will disband Parliament, is a bit of an admission. I do think it's problematic, not because I have much faith in the parliamentary calibre of our MPs particularly, and I think if they were all there, we would be safer, but because that means that the only scrutiny that we have of the government and its decision making is the media, and I don't think they're covering themselves in glory particularly. I don't think they're necessarily up to the job, but anyway, it should never just be them. And to a certain extent, kind of clamours on social media, which actually the government are looking at and their advisors are looking at, and they are responding to certain social media things, kind of trying to read things that way. So I think that's very dangerous. I do actually think that the greatest threat from this will be an erosion of democracy even further. I think that the democratic issue is one which we need to really fight hard for when we get out of lockdown.
Yeah, so at least in Greece, most politicians are now at the level of an Instagram influencer, an Instagram celebrity. So they post like photos, stay at home, and that's basically it. So today, God knows why, I've spent some hours trying to gather some conspiracy theories for the virus, which was it wasn't even fun. But at some point, I thought, it's not a conspiracy theory because I don't think it's going to happen, but let's say the government has a plan to keep this unreasonably long for whatever reason. Who would stop them? We're not allowed to protest. We haven't got anyone to represent us in the parliament. So again, I don't think for a minute that there's any big plan behind it. And actually, I don't even think that lockdown is going to be that long. But let's say that the team of 10 people around the prime minister take a completely wrong decision. In my opinion, wrong, but also many other people think it's wrong. There's no way we can stop it. And that's what we discussed last week, that I find it a bit immature to freak out about Orban. Oh, Orban is dismounting democracy. Well, there's not much democracy at the moment because we have zero way to affect even the public debate, specifically in this country. I mean, it's very interesting that in the States, one of the major kind of changes, which was pushing the FDA to use this kind of medicine, happened because Trump, who is completely out of the institutional bubble, had some weird friends who told him that, and some journalists who pushed that. And this very weird way was how an interesting discussion was pushed on the forefront. It was basically because of the vendetta between Trump and his weird kind of motley crew and the journalists. And that's how we got the discussion about should the FDA approve chloroquine or however it's called for use. In this country, we don't even have this discussion because there is no way to have this discussion. And again, I'm not saying that I know anything about it. I'm just saying that an interesting development in the discussion in the United States happened in a completely, quote, uninstitutional way.
Our next question is from Richard.
Thank you. I'm going to be as kind as I can in the coronavirus circumstances. I have a reputation for being a bit ungenerous, I think, with contributions to discussions and so on. But I'm still going to have to, and I did find myself nodding along in agreement with many of the points that were made, and I also really agree with the idea that these are complicated times, and that there are many strands that we have to try and untangle, and we'll be untangling for a long time. But I first of all wanted to pick up two things that Nikos said in his introduction, which I disagreed with, and I just wanted to sort of voice that disagreement in case you wanted to come back and clarify anything. Firstly, the idea that you abandon your ideas as soon as you get into a crisis. Well, if you hang on to everything that you held dear during a crisis, then you end up being dogmatic. And I think it's, while I wouldn't necessarily go completely down the route of saying that one needs to be a pragmatist at all moments, or flip over into being a pragmatist, I think there's also an argument for saying that if you go into something and say, well, this is my doctrine and I'm going to make it work and make it apply to every circumstance, then I think that's more headbangery than anything else. The second thing was to do with the groupthink. I really don't like this term groupthink because it's far too easily used to beat people over the head. And I think the example of the people clapping the NHS workers is exactly the sort of example where I'd say you're beating people over the head. I actually think that people going out and clapping from their balconies is about us consenting to what's going on, and therefore it's quite a positive thing. People have got their own views about what's going on, but we all at least feel that this is something that is worth doing. So the idea that we're coming together in consensus to do something does not automatically translate to some kind of herd groupthink attitude. So I need to sort of take you to task a little bit on that. Just on the dissent thing, and this is where, Claire, I feel like I want to agree with you, and at the same time I don't. And I think where I would really draw the line is when the police get involved. So up to the point where they were saying, we need to do this, you know, we're going to try and persuade you to do it, I was all for building that consensus, trying to get people to do the right thing, trying to keep people, you know, try to follow the advice as best we understood it. As soon as they started saying, right, you've got to do this, that's where I started to have a real problem. And then I started tweeting about it being a police state, because I genuinely think that if you start to get the state and the legal apparatus involved, it no longer becomes a question of us consenting and cooperating. It becomes the heavy hand. Well, the example I would draw on is the idea of the state insisting that everyone is vaccinated. Now, I know there's been a problem over the last few years of people refusing to vaccinate, and that is potentially creating problems because old diseases will come back because people are not getting inoculated. But I don't believe that the state should ever have the right to say, you must inoculate your child. I think it has to be a question of us consenting and agreeing, and we have to then live with the consequences as a society. So I really have a problem with the idea. I'm absolutely for us going along and being consenting and being having a rational argument about it. But as soon as they start to clamp down and bring in laws, and I don't think you disagree with this, Claire, but I wanted to try and nuance the point, because I think that is where I would draw the line when it comes to, you know, truncheons and heavy-handedness to try and get us to obey.
Nikos, we'll start with you now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard, because they were both very important points that you raised. So the issue of dogmatism, in a way, I advocate for the opposite. That's why I've said that during a crisis, I've changed my views on, and that was a very painful change of views because it cost me childhood friendships and all that stuff. So the question is, why would you change your views in a crisis? It would change because you see that your ideas are not good for that situation. But this is not dogmatism. This is sincerely saying, look, I thought this is, for example, freedom works. Turns out freedom does not work. Therefore, I give up freedom. However, I think that if your principle is freedom, that's why I gave the example of the person who says, I'm normally a libertarian, but. So, for example, freedom is not contradictory, even to push it even further, with someone having to be quarantined. So to use an example that someone else used, if you're in this, let's say, zombie movie, that coming 2 meters away from someone puts them into risk of something like very deadly, then I think the government has a role to tell you, no, go get locked in your room. Or if I have something, again, imaginary scenario, that will mean that if I come close to someone, I can put them to grave danger. I think the government has the right, at least, to tell me, you stay at your home until you get vaccinated. Now, I'm not talking about specific vaccines. I'm talking about the imaginary scenario that I have something that can cause objectively defined harm to people, which might not even be imaginary. But because I'm not an expert on the issue of vaccines, that's why I'm using an imaginary example. So I don't think it's dogmatism to stick to ideas. You stick to ideas not dogmatically, but because your mind tells you that this is the right idea. And if your mind tells you that, actually, I've tested my idea in this situation and it doesn't work, then if you change it, in my opinion, you are a praiseworthy person. What I'm against is saying, well, ideas is one thing and pragmatism is one thing. It's kind of this mind-body dichotomy, which is, I mean, anyway, that's a bigger discussion. Now, on the clapping for the NHS thing, at least in Greece, it was kind of politicized. That's why I was not happy with it. And to be honest, every Sunday, I send a text to a friend of mine who is a doctor in this country. And, you know, I'm telling him words that would be more compatible with, I don't know, a romantic letter or something. But that's because I have real appreciation for these doctors. But I happen not to have a huge appreciation for the institution. And I have big criticism of the institution. One of which is that it puts the doctors in a big danger and doesn't provide them with all they need. So that's why I think that this let's clap on the NHS is part of kind of a politicized process. Because, for example, I see a lot of people saying, if you're a Tory, you cannot clap on the NHS because you have voted for austerity. So this thing always gets politicized. So there's zero disrespect to the doctors. And any chance I get, I show them this respect in a personal way. But I don't think that, at least for me, going out and giving the clap is the way to do it. But again, obviously, if people find something empowering in it, if people find something in terms of, you know, a sense of community, yeah, more power to them. But I read into it a different narrative. That's why I mentioned it. But anyway, thanks for your question. I hope I answered it.
So first of all, on the clapping, I quite like the clapping. I don't mind the clapping, let's put it that way. I can see that it could get annoying. I can see that there's been attempts at shaming people who don't clap. There was a situation on one of those things where somebody said, you know, half our street didn't come out and clap, and then it ended up that half the street were actually working in hospitals, so it was ironic. But, you know, and it was like more complicated, and people near me have got an autistic kid and the clapping's actually not great. And, you know, there's all sorts of reasons why you might not be out clapping. So, but for those people who want to clap, I mean, it's a kind of social solidarity thing, and I've got no object. I find it irritating that people go on about the clapping. I don't care about the bloody clapping, but it can be politicized as well. I think it's one of those things where you don't want to over politicize something that's actually not that significant. But when then it gets turned into a political issue, then you want to maybe comment on it. That's a slightly different question. But social solidarity and people trying to find ways of showing appreciation is nice, you know, and, you know, people giving, I heard about, you know, people going into the local Tesco's and handing the staff, you know, hand cream and, you know, gloves and being nice. And when you walk around, people catch each other's eye, and we're all social distancing, but we're noticing each other. All of these things, like, this is an attempt at creating social bonds when we're being asked to behave in the most antisocial. We're trying to be sociable in the most antisocial, brutalizing, anti-human circumstances where we're told to not have any contact with each other. And I think, therefore, the attempts at creating ways of showing that we care for each other are to be lauded largely, or certainly not to be lampooned too much. Just on the dissent point, I mean, I agree with you, Richard, that I myself, you know, have been going on and on about the police overreacting. I completely can see the dangers of the enforced lockdown, and was very nervous when Matt Hancock went off on Andrew Marr on Sunday morning, trying to imply that, oh, now we've got proof that we've got to force you to stay in, and the police being heavy-handed. But before this discussion started, I made a point, and somebody had actually raised this in one of the questions that I just looked at, about people reveling in catastrophe. But there's a kind of reveling on both sides, because there is a danger that we overstate everything, right? So I think it's overstated that there are loads of people going out having picnics in parks. That is just, it's almost like people gleefully wanting to see that. Or when I say people, some people are making a project out of shaming their neighbours or other people by putting out these photographs of people and crowds and all the rest of it, saying who are they when it's never them. But I also don't want to play the same game where I kind of take egregious examples of police reaction and then turn that into, we now live in a police state. I mean, this is not a police state. Anyone who thinks this is what a police state feels like, it's not like what a police state feels like, let me tell you. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be wary of the police reveling in new powers. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have great scrutiny over that bill and the Act of Parliaments, and make sure that there's sunset clauses, that they're temporary, etc., etc. I'm not suggesting we're naive, but on the other hand, I don't want to create our own climate fear, our own bogeymen, where we basically say the coppers are clamping down, it's going to be here forever, we're never going to escape it, they're doing a kind of grab of our liberty. So for me, even though it might sound odd, I think we have to be balanced. And I think the reason I say that is because if you really care about liberty and freedom, you don't want to treat it as a game. You have to be very careful about when you say it's been taken, and you have to be very careful not to kind of be immature in accusations of it being stolen or abused, if you see what I mean. And I think we have to recognize that you can make a consent for a temporary loan of your freedom in order to solve a problem, without that meaning you're intellectually abandoning a commitment to liberty. My fear is that there's not enough of an intellectual commitment to freedom that undercuts all this, and that we're going to have to fight for that intellectually. And it does worry me that if you actually point out some of the egregious overreach by the police, that people then accuse you of being, trying to kill people and irresponsible, and that's obviously hopeless as well. So, but I think balance. By the way, Lord Sumption's been magnificent on this, and that will indicate to you how our weird ideas are. Here's a guy who was absolutely hopeless on Brexit, in my opinion, right? And then he comes out as being like magnificent on civil liberties. Piers Morgan, who did a bloody good job as a Remain voter of defending Brexit, has turned into an utter, total, fanatical lunatic when it comes to COVID-19. So in that sense, labels don't work this time. They never did, actually. And you have to take people for what they say in the middle of a crisis, rather than presuming you know what they're going to think.
The question about people reveling in the catastrophe is next. Sarah asks in the chat, hi Claire, Nikos. What do you think about people who appear to be reveling in the catastrophe? Dismissing encouraging facts such as the declining daily cases and deaths in Italy and Spain. What is the appeal of the lockdown and shutdown of society in this way? Is it just anti-humanism that you speak of, or are you more nervous and welcoming of authority? Are we more nervous and welcoming of authority than we used to be?
I don't think people are reveling in it. I think that this, again, is one of those trends that underlie, it's been around for some time. I actually wrote about how the catastrophizing of situations actually affected free speech when I wrote my book on. I find that offensive. I was trying to understand why young people would want safety, and how in some ways they'd been scared by the catastrophic, Hollywood's hyperbole, the kind of idea that the world is nigh, that death is around the corner. Greta Thunberg obviously scaring the life out of her peers about the climate emergency and so on. We're familiar with that. And I think that one of the things that I most object to, particularly in the way the media have dealt with this crisis, but also quite a lot of the scientists, is they take a worst case scenario as though it's the end result. In other words, we've kind of lost a sense of proportion. So I think that people, it's not that people are reveling, it's just that they're used to thinking, oh, maybe it's going to be worse. We've become pessimistic about our capacity to deal with issues. And now we're in a real health crisis. It's almost like you see the worst always. And I think that we need to have a sense of proportion. People need to know that you can plan for the worst case outcome. In fact, it would be irresponsible if you didn't plan for the worst case outcome. And that would have included if there was a no deal Brexit. If you remember when those reports were leaked, everybody said, oh my God, this is what's going to happen. It was no, these are the worst case scenario outcomes. We've got to know what we would do if that happened. That doesn't mean that's what's going to happen. And I think people want a sense of certainty and want to know what's going to happen, and immediately assume that in a fairly conspiratorial way, that the government are lying and covering up the worst that can happen. The government then think, oh God, we better, reveal more. Then they come out with the worst case scenario, and then everyone says, I knew it was going to be as bad as all that. And in the end, we are infantilized by it, because what we need to be able to do is to deal with the complexity of not actually knowing what's going to happen and being able to understand that this could happen, but it's not necessarily going to happen. So I don't think people are enjoying it, but they've been well trained in the kind of the politics of fear and the culture of fear.
Yeah, Claire mentioned his book. I find that offensive, and there's a great line there. I'm going to paraphrase it. You say something like, "We used to tell kids, don't worry, there is no boogeyman under the bed," and now we're telling kids basically there is a boogeyman under the bed. But again, the complication in this case is that there might be something like a boogeyman. Yeah, so it's way more difficult. So, and Sarah, I'm super positively inclined to what. So basically, I was enraged with the phenomenon you discussed, specifically the United States. And I think I mentioned last week, or I don't remember in which event, some particular examples where, let's say, Trump mentions a good thing, and then everyone says, no, it's not that. Yeah. Or CNN the other day had an article that says, antibodies test, the hope that wasn't. And you have to read for 10 minutes. So basically says, FDA hasn't approved the antibody test, whatever you hear is not the case. And you reach the end of the article to say, oh, by the way, I was talking about one, but there are 5 others that are. But I don't know. I thought it was kind of this attitude of the media to fear monger. But yesterday I had a discussion with a friend who is a journalist, and he kind of gave me his point of view, and I realized it's not that simple. And actually, I find myself having the opposite bias. So for at least 10 days, so for example, I don't go to my timeline on Twitter. I go to Twitter and I check specific people. But then I realized this is also kind of catastrophizing from the opposite, because I only pick people that I know are optimists. But at the end of the day, it shows what Claire said, being an independent thinker is very, 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 very difficult. And I realized that myself, just going to the optimist people, in a way, I'm also a second-hander, to use like the objectivist terminology. It's not original thinking if I dismiss, let's say, the bad things and I only go to the good things. So I do think some people are reveling in the catastrophe, and I still think that there is a lot of media bias that has to do with politics. But I think as this goes on, more and more people will be craving for good news. So I think we'll see this slightly retreating, and we see, I mean, objectively, we have a lot of good news, but also I think there's going to be this catastrophe fatigue, this disaster fatigue slowly. And this is even more interesting in the long term. So for example, what is the effect of this discussion, of the climate change discussion? Is it going to be more proportionate to the reality? So we estimate the objective risk. Or is it, so for example, I send an email to a person that I really appreciate and respect to check if he's okay. He's an old professor of mine. And in his reply, his reply was, yes, this is very bad. But what could be even worse is that climate change might kick in. So you see that people are going to interpret things based more or less on their pre-existing views. So I have some hope that we're going to be more kind of optimist. And okay, I don't want to take the thunder away from other events, but on Saturday I was with Claire together online on another event, and Frankfurt 8 gave the example of some big disasters in the future, like Hiroshima. And he said that after some days, the trams were running or life was back to normal. But again, you have to see what was the view of life of different societies. So are we going to change this gloomy view of life? I hope, but it's not going to be automatic. We have to do a lot of intellectual work to make this happen.
We have a live question from Zoe.
Today we had this thing of Airbnb getting in trouble for continuing to let out places for like self-isolation retreats. So things like families wanting to go to lighthouses and do their isolation there. And the crackdown that came from the tourism minister, whatever his official title is, was worded in a way that clearly to me seemed like he was going after the idea of pleasure, leisure, and enjoyment, not anything to do with safety. I know that there's the other thing about you're not supposed to leave your hospital area or whatever because the rural areas can't take it, but that wasn't really what was foregrounded. So that combined with the sort of police swooping in on picnickers and Primrose Hill, who are completely in their own family cluster, completely distanced from everyone else, I just wondered if we can sort of maybe distill down the idea of pleasure and ask to which that might be the way we can read maybe a tightening authoritarianism. So as soon as it stops being about, being rooted in epidemiological or public health framework and starts being about you're not allowed to have fun. And then, so to me, that's sinister. And I wondered what you thought. But I thought a related question with that is, the degree to which pleasure and having fun is kind of commensurate with the perceptions of this crisis, because there's this bizarre disconnect really between, on one hand, people dying and this terrifying thing of this rolling incubation period where you may be fine today, but what you did 5 days ago may be about to catch up with you. And it's a sort of very stressful thing. And on the other hand, and sort of nasty and tragic and everything else. On the other hand, you have people being creative with like Pilates in the communal garden or people, trying to have a picnic, but it's almost like it just doesn't fit there's not even particularly good reasons for being uncomfortable with some of those forms of pleasure, especially when they're taking place in public. So it seems to be something about it maybe being incongruous or something like that. Just reminded me, I don't know if you saw this couple marooned in the Maldives on their honeymoon said that, everyone's jealous of us, but actually when you can't leave, it's not fun. So they're in the Maldives, supposed to be having fun on their honeymoon, and they can't have fun. So there's something going on with pleasure, I thought. And then just a second question is about myth making and ideas of Britishness. And there's a lot, obviously the Blitz is being invoked a lot. And there's a sort of active, just as it was then, this active idea that, well, the way we do things here is that obviously perfectly cut out for kind of soldiering on in adversity. We did it before. We did it in World War II, and we're going to do it again now. And I was just looking at a book today, I think called The Myth of the Blitz, actually, about all the kind of socially kind of deviant, or not deviant, inconsiderate, sort of rule-breaking, antisocial behavior that was going on in the Blitz and stuff. And the idea of the myth just being kind of constantly everywhere and updated, so that everything was slotted into the myth of, well, this is how we as British people do this. And I just wondered if we're doing that now, and if it's helpful, or if it's not helpful, or who cares? So yeah, there we go.
Well, we'll start with the personification of keeping calm and carrying on, Nikos.
That was a sarcastic comment. Okay. So I think the pleasure and intimacy question is the most interesting one. So there always has been some parts of, at least the people we can listen to in the media and all that stuff, or in policy making, what we call killjoys. And we've seen it with various policies, and that's, but what is the extent of this? I don't know. But so I can't actually answer the question because I haven't got an answer. But to build on the question, I think it's very interesting if this is going to have any change after this. So whether we're going to live in a world, for example, where social distancing is going to be there for, I don't know, for months or for years, and even if it's not mandated, it's still in our head. Or it's the opposite, and I hear people saying, at some point when this is over, we're going to have this huge party and everyone's going to hug each other. And I mean, in my mind, it was something like that when Greece won the European Championship in 2004. So how this is going to change human behavior, and by the way, back then, it's going to be way more difficult to be a killjoy. Or to put an even more specific example, I think the first thing the Greek government should have done after the lockdown is to end the smoking ban, like immediately, because Greeks will have this need of like socializing, and because it's part of the culture, and also that we need also to boost the economy, because even before the COVID, the smoking ban had an effect on life. So it will be interesting to see how this kind of lifestyle policing is gonna play out on that. Now, on the second part of the question. Initially, a lot of people said, well, it was the keep calm and carry on, and now we're freaking out. But I don't think it's the same thing, because it's unclear what the heroic act is. I mean, in a war, what the heroic act is more or less whether there is some moral understanding of the war. So, for example, the Second World War, it's clear. The Nazis are the bad guys, take a rifle and go fight them, because even a death is better than living under the Third Reich. Whereas now it's quite unclear what is the virtuous act. So I find myself in a very difficult position. For example, I find myself advocating, for more freedom and questioning the lockdown, whereas in my personal life, I self-isolated earlier, and I will probably leave the house much later than the average Joe. But I don't think there's necessarily a contradiction to that, because it's quite unclear, again, what. So I think the responsible thing for me to do, although I have trust in, my immune system or whatever, is to stay at home. At the same time, I think there is a battle to be fought in all this. But who exactly the enemy is and what exactly the right track is something which is very difficult. But it's an excellent question. So I will also be interested to hear Zoe's views once we give the answer.
So I think actually part of the myth making and part of the way that we are told that we have to live at the moment in the lockdown is that it's posited as a kind of sacrifice and a duty. We're all in this together. We all have to give something up. And I think that, that was kind of very much the kind of Queen's speech, a bit of self-deprecation about and humor. It wasn't bulldog spirit. It was more, we have to give this up temporarily for everyone. That's what we've got to do. And that seems at odds then with this idea of people kind of going off on their holidays, as it were, even though, in fact, the self-isolating in an Airbnb, it's utterly ludicrous that anyone should object to it or would object to it. And in the way that you said, that kind of the whole discussion about sunbathing was extraordinarily vicious, that people would stop and sit down and enjoy the sun was causing deaths, was mad, didn't fit in with any kind of medical advice, got nothing to do with epidemiology. It was just, you can't be seen to be doing that because we're actually all in this together sacrificing. So that kind of joyless aspect of it, or joyless when it's more that kind of, no, we're all meant to be sacrificing, so you can't do something against it. And there's definitely something in that. It's also true that the joyless public health lobby have not given up. So obviously all over social media, people make jokes about having Zoom and, all those kind of drinks and all the rest of it. People saying, how are you getting through this? People say gin. I know you've got people saying we're very worried about how much alcohol everyone's consuming. And you think, oh, go away. And then you realize they're serious. There's been some policy people who've actually been advocating that what they need to do in the middle of this is to bring in a smoking ban, because smokers, I have smoked throughout this whole discussion, by the way, but smokers are going to not do as well on the respirators. So, they should be. Luckily, actually, the sensible medics and scientists said, Jesus, it's stressful enough if that was banning smoking in people's households. That would actually, and medically, would be bad for your immune system. If I stop smoking now, it would be bad for me, as the scientists have explained. So that shows you. But what I mean is, there will still be people who will try and make this a kind of joyless experience, but it's not. I think there's a sort of sentiment that you can't be seen to be indulging in anything in this. Anyway, I think it's fascinating what you said, and it's terrible. What you don't want is this ridiculous, joyless attitude to it. On the myth making then, which fits in exactly, which is, I think actually I can only elaborate on what Nikos said, which was brilliant, which is it's unclear what the heroic role is. So it's really weird because everybody I know, lots of people I know, are trying to be volunteers because they want to do something. You know what I mean? They've signed up as NHS volunteers. A lot of them have been rejected. They're driving around, dropping off meals to the homeless. They're knocking on doors. They're setting up community groups and doing also. They want to actively engage in helping us as a society get out of this. And yet the formal message is save lives, stay at home. Right? So you don't know whether you're being heroic by staying in. I can't decide whether I'm going to be irresponsible if I go and try and help the neighbours, or whether I'm being generous. I can't work it out. I'm thinking I'm actually, of all people that's likely to have this bloody thing and pass it on, it's more likely to be me than anyone, and I don't want to be responsible for that. And yet I can see the kind of young neighbours next door struggling, and I want to help them, right? So I don't know what to do. So you don't know what that heroic role is. And I think that means that the myth making of the Second World War, which has been utterly unhelpful throughout the whole of this experience, because it doesn't help you. I mean, you might say Blitz spirit, we got through it, but I mean, most of us weren't alive. Most of the people who are saying it weren't alive. It's a myth. There might be that, but it also, at that time, in a war situation, if you were a conscientious objector, you made a political decision to not fight. Or if you were in certain countries, you joined the resistance and risked your life to kill people. Or you joined the army or the RAF or whatever it is, if you were pro the war or what have you. You did all these things. You made politically active choices about action that you took to make you the hero of the story. And although the myth making might be mythical, it's also true that many people did actually have a role to play. And the people who were kind of disparaged were like the spivs or the people who kind of, tried to exploit the consequences. The problem now is, if you want to be the hero of this story, it requires that you passively do nothing. And it's very difficult. And so it seems to me that the myth of the Second World War is almost trying to make us think we're in the historical shadow of that as part of it, because that's the British myth. No doubt every country will have its own version. But actually, it's so frustrating because it requires that you watch and are sidelined in history, which is why I think so many people want to volunteer. And because the British state's so bloody bureaucratic, they've even messed that up. Because people keep trying to volunteer. So many people who've volunteered as NHS volunteers, by the way, have not been contacted yet, which is great. You know what I mean? They're keen to get out and do something, and they're still waiting for the forms to be filled in, which is obviously annoying for people.
Zoe, did you have a follow-up?
Just, I mean, both very interesting responses. So thank you. I mean, I guess this is, I think, what's being so tricky in terms of offering political analysis of this is that it is such a psychological. I mean, that's basically what you said before, that it's such a psychological phenomenon, the way people are responding. And I think, in a way, for a psychological, it's a medical disaster, but it's also a psychological thing. And so we're clinging to, so the myth may be bankrupt and unhelpful, but I think it's incredibly helpful or natural to reach for any kind of template to organize otherwise completely, there's like a void of, as Claire says, of what we are supposed to be doing. So the myth is helpful there. And I think the British myth thing is interesting because, as you say, doing nothing is a weird thing to be heroic. But in Britain, I feel more than perhaps in other places, it's this sort of heroism of small acts, or even of an attitude. So in a way, it's the kind of grand show that is maybe what French people would do, but a British heroism is perhaps sitting at home. And I think there's a clever thing happening where that's being, that kind of the blitzy kind of British stiff upper lips, small D's, keep calm, carry on thing is being used to shore up the sense of pride in sitting there and doing nothing potentially. But yeah, anyway, thank you. That was interesting.
Okay, so Nikos, there was a follow-up to something you said earlier. Ella asks, can you say more about the attitude of the media you get from your friend working in the industry?
Yeah, so my friend told me, so we had this, I started on the attack, like, the media. And he asked something serious, says, okay, so what exactly should the media do? So should they invite more, let's say, of the heterodox? Yeah, we could say they could do that, but or should they not report, let's say, on there are some obvious cases of misreporting that could even reach the level of fake news. But it's one thing saying, yeah, the media are scaring us, and it's a different thing asking the question, what would an objective reporting should do? And for those who are friends of the meetup, there's an interesting segment from an episode by Yaron Brook, and the YouTube title, "You Should Be Outraged." And this is exactly right. You should be outraged with the way that governments have dealt with it. But for the media to take this role, it's one thing, to ask difficult questions, and it's another thing for the media to have kind of the mental state that I have, which is like perpetual rage with what is happening. So I'm not sure that if tomorrow, like the BBC would tell me, you're our new editor, I would have a ready-made list of how this should be covered. So the easy answer is ask harder questions and question the narrative in a harder way. But again, it's easy. I realize that sometimes it's easier said than done.
So we'll go to Paul Thomas for now.
Hello. Yeah, I wanted to come back, Nikos, on you saying that people are scared. A couple of days ago on the radio, there was Kevin Maguire, who's a journalist for The Mirror. He was on 5 Live, and I tend to disagree with whatever Kevin Maguire says about anything. And he said that people are absolutely terrified, which sounds to me more like wishful thinking of journalists than anything else. I don't see any great examples of this fear. I see some of them. Over the last week, I was talking last week on the Zoom to other people and saying, I go walking along the Leeds-Liverpool Canal. I do a 6-mile walk every day. And the canal path is between 1 and 2 meters wide at various points. And up till last week, about a third of people were standing as far aside as possible. The rest of us were walking normally along, about a third were standing aside. Now it's probably 2/3 of people doing that. But I don't see great signs of fear. I just see people following what they think is the protocol that should be followed at the moment. The odd little fear I see is I see the occasional person with a face mask who does stand really well back. I saw one girl a few days ago in the distance who I saw stand as far away from somebody and turn her back. And then when I got to her, she did the same again. And I realized she was actually even holding her breath while she was doing it. But these are only kind of minor examples, but maybe it's self-selecting that those of us who aren't afraid go out and have a walk. And maybe the people who are afraid are inside all afraid. I don't know how this is measured. I don't know how we can measure this. I don't know how we can say how frightened people are and how we can come to any conclusion about that, really.
Well, you can't come to a conclusion, Paul, but, you know, the art of politics is kind of getting us feeling for what's going on, and people are bloody scared. I mean, everywhere there's no evidence of anything else. You know, people are in a situation where throughout the world, there is an atmosphere. There is no kickback against the lockdown anywhere, right? That's one thing. And that's because they think it's not because they've all become compliant lunatics overnight. It's because they think it's the best way to stop the virus. You know, this is a virus that threatens people and they are scared, and the overwhelming nature of what it can do to the health service, because health services aren't equipped for pandemics. Why would they be? And everyone getting ill at the same time. And then they're also scared of the consequences of the lockdown, the fact the economy is going to tank. I mean, when we were talking before about how to be a hero, or what's the heroic, virtuous person in this, I think we have to ask people to consider what they're going to do post the lockdown myself. I think, you know, the rebuilding of a resilient society and a free society is going to be the way we need to appeal to people to get over that fear, to move forward, to look forward, because we're going to have to really help each other, right? Because some people are going to be in penury and have no money and no jobs, and we could be like you know, this isn't saying it could be like the great crash of the 20s is not a lie, is it? Right? We just closed down the economy of the world, right? So I think that in this instance, there is a rational reason to be frightened, but being consumed by fear shouldn't paralyze you. That's the only way I could say. It can be a rational thing to know that this is scary. We also aren't used to having to all deal with our own mortality all at the same time, if you see what I mean. You know, like in that sense, it is a bit more like a war, you know, because in a war, the life-death question is kind of, and obviously there's parts of the world, by the way, I do understand where it's not peace. But what I mean is where the whole world at the same time is going, oh my God, we don't have a way of controlling nature. You know, we haven't got the answer. We haven't got the medical answer to this. We don't know what to do. Once you get it, you're not able, they can't cure you. They can hope that their interventions mean you don't suffer or die, but there's no cure. So in that sense, I think in a way, it would be anybody who thinks that it's not a scary moment is deluding themselves, in my opinion. It is a scary thing. There's nothing wrong with being frightened, but fear should not determine policy or paralyze you from acting or having a way of understanding the world. That would be the way I would see it. Is that a bit pessimistic? Sounding a bit grim.
Yeah, so so fear is not something, it's not like body fat that you carry it all the time with you. So there are times when, as Claire says, it's impossible, to hear that the Prime Minister is in intensive care and not feel at least this momentary kind of pop, the fear going slightly up, because, although, someone could say that objectively, if you could pick one person who has the most chances of getting it, it's someone who has been outside of the lockdown and having to meet a lot of people. So you could rationalize it. You could say, yes, Boris was in a bigger risk than, the average person. But the mere fact of empathy drives to this worry, which then it also translates to your own fear. I mean, even if you live in a castle and you haven't seen anyone for a month, there's always this element. But I mean, I agree that there's no panic, which is good. So most people keep this into perspective. But if I had an answer, how to overcome fear, well, I would have used it to myself and be happy all the time during the lockdown, which is not the case. I have ups and I have downs, and I haven't got anything to add to what Claire says. It's, if you don't feel anything, you're not paying attention.
Okay, our next question is from Tom.
Perhaps this is a crazy thesis, Claire. I'm not pitching for the battle of ideas, but I want to talk about challenging groupthink and skepticism. When I was younger, I thought that society was on a trajectory to rationalism and a facts-based society. I imagined flying cars and space travel. We've got the internet and iPhones, which I think is probably better. What would I do on the moon? We've achieved a lot in terms of equality, for women and ethnic minorities and gay rights. But I think we've given a foothold for like postmodernist ideas, moral relativism, the rejection of expertise. Do you think that this may be the root of some of these conspiracy nutters related to 5G? All of that, we've allowed these bad theories to infect us, all opinions are of equal value. And I also think possibly that the government response to some of these questions is affected by this, by not giving us the truth and being clear about what's happening, in case they alarm us or offend some demographic. Perhaps at the end of this, we will come out valuing knowledge more. I don't know. That's just, what do you think of that idea? Is it crazy?
Right. So, I mean, taking into account the circumstances, and this is another way I want to agree with Paul's previous point, that most people are, reasonably taking this in a rational way. So the conspiracy theories are not, so as I said earlier, I spent some time today trying to kind of collect some conspiracy theories. Most people do try to keep, I think, a clear head, at least from what I see in social media and what I see in terms of how many people the conspiracists attract. So maybe when things get real, what we say, reality kicks in, then people realize that, yeah, now it's the time also for me to stand up to the occasion. But I think it's also a bit early. So what you said, though, on the fact that we lack information, and again, to link it to the previous point, I think this is also related to the issue of fear, because fear is mostly uncertainty. And there is also an element of a responsibility by, I don't know, the media, the authorities, how you want to call it, for this uncertainty. For example, still, there are so many questions about how do we count the COVID victims, and there is no clear answer, or there's no authoritative answer that has stopped this discussion. Or about the issues, every week we hear about a new, hopeful treatment from existing medicines, and we still don't know if these things are used in the UK. So this kind of curtain of silence, so to speak, on these issues also plays a role in fear. But whether we come out of it better, I mean, let me reverse the question. Why would we do that? I mean, we could, but not how would we do it? What would we have to do? for, let's say, our ideas that we share most of in the panel and the participants to win? What would we have to do this? There are some things. For example, we could focus on the role of the human mind, of science, as you said, of reason, of freedom. And then maybe we are on a better position to advocate for these things. And always, if they come together with a success, we're going to have a better case. Like, look, we won. Remember how fearful we were and how scared we were. And yet we won because of these good principles that you mentioned. So this would be the opportunity. It's not guaranteed, though. I don't know. So, I mean, again, drawing from a familiar example, I don't think that most people in Greece, I don't think we went out of the crisis as much better thinkers as before the crisis. Or I could even say, because of the disappointment specific after the referendum, it was almost led to nihilism. So it depends. It depends. There's no guarantee that after the crisis, you're going to come better or worse. And it depends also on what we all do.
So it is undoubtedly the case that the notion of a truth, or even the pursuit of truth, has suffered under the overwhelming intellectual assault on it by postmodernism over the years, or those kind of trends, right? That is true. That is true. And it was always ironic during the debates around leaving the European Union, when people talked about fake news and post-truth society, as though somehow that was the creation of this kind of bunch of people over there who don't believe the media and look on social media all the time, and you can't establish what is a reliable source, that they were the very people who, in a different academic setting, were the champions of there's no such thing as objective truth themselves. So they never noticed that they were the people who gave it its intellectual wings, that whole atmosphere. So that's true. That's a deep-seated problem. That's not got worse or better. What I was trying to say earlier is, a lot of the times what's happened is we can see what's already underneath the surface of society in a crisis. It brings to the forefront what we already know. And conspiracy theories, it undoubtedly fit into that whole thing about you don't know what to believe. But one of the difficulties we've got is, that kind of cliche, just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you, is that we've also been through, in this country at least, a period of time in which the establishment has tried to, in front of our eyes in many ways, undermine what we decided in a democratic vote. I mean, I know that it's it seems weird talking about Brexit now, but it was a quite profound 4 years of noticing that they just lied to us. They then said we were lied to by Russian bots, you know what I mean? And then they said, we are Democrats. And we watched them talk about us and try and take away from us what we decided to do. So people have lost confidence in authority figures and in the establishment. They've allowed their own, worlds. I mean, some of the people who are now the leading scientists were, as I say, some of the most pernicious when it came to that democratic decision. So it makes people feel very ambivalent about who they can trust and what they can trust and so on. So I think the foundations, the kind of web of meaning, have been really kind of stripped back, and people not sure what to believe in. So that makes it really difficult. But I a couple of things, I don't, because I think you said, is it that the politicians don't give us the truth because they don't want to alarm us? And on the one hand, I'm not keen on oversimplifying issues in order to kind of message or send messages. But I have to say, been quite admiring of the government in the UK, at least, for not trying, for at least trying to have some sense of calm. There's been a kind of rising hysteria, which is understandable, as I've said. I mean, I can understand that as you look around the world and you think what's going to happen, and they try to kind of keep calm. I think at times they've then given in to the clamour and overreacted. I do think that. I do think the lockdown was too early. I don't think they should have closed the schools when they did. They had no scientific basis for closing the schools at all. They didn't think they should close the schools, but what happened was that basically teachers weren't turning up to teach, so it all got very complicated, or it wasn't straightforwardly science. So I think that there is an argument for not exacerbating fears, and that point therefore about the kind of the bogeyman under the bed, and now You know, you used to say to children, there's no bogeyman. It's also the case that I think there's nothing wrong with saying, you know, the bogeyman is not as frightening as you think, and we can get on top of this. By the way, I do not think COVID is the end of the world. I mean, I'm now worried I've bent the stick the other way now on the fear front. It is a virus. We will find an antidote to this virus. I don't know what the consequences of the economy are going to be with a prolonged lockdown internationally. And I think a lot of people are going to suffer. And I'm worried about the people who are not getting medical treatment whilst all the hospitals are given over to dealing with the COVID virus. So I know, and other people will know, people who've had their cancer treatments cancelled, you know, brain tumor removal has just been cancelled, somebody I know. It's scary, and you wouldn't want to get ill. You wouldn't want to get knocked off your bike, fall off a ladder, or have a heart attack at the moment because nobody took a blind bit of notice you. Because why would, I mean, you know, that's not fair, but you know what I mean? So there will be all sorts of consequences, but it's also important that we recognize that this is not the end of the world, right? This is not the Armageddon. It is a horrible thing to have to deal with, and we need to get through it. And how, therefore, we deal with it is going to be crucial, because the reason I'm saying this is whether we come out of this better or worse, the Hiroshima example that was mentioned earlier, or any major catastrophe, in different periods historically, people have come through and said, right, now we are going to resiliently rebuild society. Now, the problem we've got is that the underlying way that people view themselves at the present time, nothing to do with COVID-19, is as vulnerable. I mean, every young person, the characterization of Generation Snowflake, which I know is a caricature, is that people see themselves as vulnerable, not able to cope with bad words, you know, with difficult ideas. They want to censor and ban them. So, you know, appealing to people for a kind of resilient fight back is a bit daunting when the overriding sort of way that we view ourselves generally is as vulnerable. Now, the vulnerability shtick, when we are actually vulnerable to a virus, is hard to overcome. But it does, I'm not fatalistic about it. And the reason this is all about ideas. The reason why any of us have fought for ideas is I've never really been on the winning side of many of the ideas I've fought for. I mean, you know, Brexit was a weird aberration in my whole history. And, you know, suddenly I thought, God, I've won something, I can't believe it. And I hadn't won it at all, but I was pleased to be on the winning side. But it's not as though as somebody who's espoused a free society, free speech, you know, ifs, no buts, all of these different ideas that I've fought for over the years. I mean, largely I've been on the losing side. But the reason I thought it was important to fight for them was because there was always people out there who it resonated with. They themselves, just like I changed my mind because somebody had an argument with me, I'm prepared to have the arguments in case somebody's listening. So I think that the point of what you're doing, what we try and do at the Academy of Ideas, what any of us try and do, is to still win those battle of ideas, because it just seems to me that fatalistically, if we sit back and sort of let it play its course, the vulnerable shtick will win, and we won't be good at rebuilding things after COVID-19. But if we keep winning this argument, there'll be more of us who've got the courage to get over our own vulnerability and to build, you know, to go back to building the free society that we all want. And we'll probably argue with each other about how we should do it, but at least we won't be cowering in the corner. And that's the most vile bit of this for me, is that the lockdown feels like cowering in the corner. You know, my instinct is to not want to cower, and yet we're being forced to stay indoors and keep away from everything. And so my instinct in that context is to write more, organize more meetings, argue more. And even if I'm sitting at home, I'm not shutting up.
Let me go first to Tom and see if you have a follow-up.
Yeah, well, in terms of the sort of the information coming out of the government, the things that are sort of I'm finding very, very unclear is the delivery of PPE equipment. They just say they've got so many 100 million pieces of it, and we're doing our best to get it out. They don't. What would be really helpful, I think, is which areas are struggling. Is it the Southwest? Is it Pacific hospitals? Is it you know, is it St. George's where Boris is? Is that the one that's got how? I'd like to see the performance on a chart somewhere. All of these different vendors are like Dyson and McLaren are making ventilators. When are they going to be ready? You know, these people want to make your JCB. How many will they have and by when? Also, at the hospital where I work, last weekend, we had 60 attendances for A&E over the weekend. Normally we have 1,500. I just had a picture from one of my colleagues, and A&E there is empty. So if I fell off a ladder now, I think I'd be okay. They have specific COVID wards. So it's the specifics. You know, I don't think the populace can understand specifics. If one hospital is really struggling to get this equipment, tell us specifically they're having trouble transporting it down the M6 or whatever. Tell us that. And that's what I feel so frustrated that they're not telling us the details. They just say bland, overarching statements. You know, take this hospital, the 8,000 bed hospital in East London. Is it East London? It's open. It's got 8,000 beds potentially, but only 500 are open at the moment. They've not talked about staffing. We don't know. Is there going to be a pharmacy there? Is there going to be an X-ray there in case, you know, we just don't know what facilities are there. I'd like to see the details. Anyway, that's just a statement, not really a question.
Could I just quickly say something? Razi, is that okay? I think you make a really good point. My frustration with journalism, because I think this is what journalism should be doing, is not keep asking general questions about PPE and not keep asking general questions about ventilators. I mean, great article, by the way, in the Spectator today about somebody who says, God, the obsession with ventilators is as bad as the obsession with toilet rolls. You know what I mean? The ventilators isn't what we need. You know what I mean? And actually, PPE is much more important, and there's I mean, I don't mean we don't need any ventilators, but it's almost like that. And that's what I get frustrated with, a kind of the journalist questions, because I think they should be doing what you're suggesting, Tom, which is going out and doing some bloody investigating. Because I think that these kind of questions need to be addressed. I completely agree, but with detail, not just saying to the politicians, what are you doing about PPE delivery, but actually going out and saying, I've talked to these people, and some, by the way, journalists are doing a great job at doing that. But that's why I think the press conference just doesn't work, because what happens is they're not put under any pressure, because it's bland meets bland in a way. So it just comes over as a general attack, and them say bland things back. Then the journalists come back, they've got no detail. When there's a specific, detailed answer, then actually they rise to the game a bit, or you can see they're lying, which is fair enough, because they probably might be, yeah? Because they've obviously made a mess about PPE. It's obvious to all of us that this is a mess and they don't know what they're doing. And I would like, again, as you say, a proper detailed breakdown of some of these stories, so that then we can hold them to account, and that would make better politics. Anyway, sorry, it's a rant.
Yeah, just as a final word, I mean, what Tom said brought to my mind the issue of infantilization of the public, which is a discussion we've had for years. I mean, also among other places in the battle of ideas. And I think a specific example of this is this withdrawing, let's say, of information. Because I don't know what's the point? Is it that, you know, it's either that the public won't understand because they're stupid, or that they will freak out, which I don't think the case, because as Tom said, the general idea we get is not that, oh, you know, this is out of control and we can't go. So I don't even see what is the practical reason why there is this lack of crucial information. And I think everyone would be better off. We would have more trust in the government, because we'd think there's a point in sitting down at 5 o'clock, whatever time is, and listening to this press conference. And I think it would clarify many things. But anyway, that was a good point by Tom.
All right. So a few years ago, before I chaired one of my first panels, Andrew Bernstein, who was on that panel, said to me, make sure you end on a positive note. So I'll do now what I did back then and say that as chair, I have the privilege of delegating that to the speakers. So if either of you or both of you have a positive note that we can end on, please go ahead.
Somebody has written here, at this point, I'm more scared of the lockdown than the virus. And it's not something we particularly addressed. And I think it's worth saying something about that, which is there's no doubt about it that the consequences of the fact that there's an international lockdown are potentially, we might look back and say it was an overreaction, not the right way to deal with this. All of the scientific stuff that I've read indicates that the big issue was social distancing, and the lockdown was just them abandoning trusting us to do it ourselves. And then because, well, country does it, everybody does it, and nobody knows how to get out of it. And so you might think she's not ending on a positive note. I think, however, I have noted that there are more people around the world. You can see that people are beginning to come up with exit strategies because they know that they've got to get out of this. And it, you know, apparently Denmark today, I think it's Denmark today, has started to talk about an exit strategy and come up with a detailed one. Even Italy started to do it. A lot of the journalist questions today were actually on exit strategies. Don't know if it's quite right for the UK yet, but people starting to say, how are we going to rebuild? So that's kind of on the one hand. The other thing is that I've been really impressed by what Paul mentioned, which is I think people are really scared, but they are up for the challenge of this. And there is a sort of sense in which people think we're not going to let this defeat us, you know. And even if they're doing that by staying indoors or by volunteering or trying to help the neighbours or kind of overcoming their fear, I think the kind of being forced to look mortality in the eye, something as big as this, can mean that people will have an opportunity to reassess. I don't think it's given that we'll come out of this with better politics. We might come out of it with worse politics, but we'll certainly have a way of communicating with each other. And I don't mean via Zoom. And this is kind of like the world's water cooler moment. You know what I mean? I mean, you won't have nothing to talk to people about. We'll all have been through something together, and deciphering it and working out what we got wrong, where our instincts weren't correct or where we were right, and without saying I told you so, actually collectively, intellectually working that through after this is for me a great hope. And I actually think that I've read some brilliant articles, not just amongst friends. I've read some terrible, awful stuff, but I've also read some really great, where people are really forced to think about things and going over and beyond. And I intend to kind of contact anyone I think has written anything great and start a dialogue with them. And I think, therefore, the human spirit can not only get through this, but we can make something good of it. But we've got to consciously do it and not hope it will happen spontaneously.
Here's why I'm a very optimist. Like, think where we were a week ago, or 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago. And okay, now we've caught ourselves with some worrying news coming up, which was that the Prime Minister, you know, there was this development with his health. But see the big picture. We're better informed, and some of the scenarios of last week, which is the usual thing, oh, we're 2 weeks away from being Italy, is not there, at least in most countries. We've understood more about what happened in Italy. And there is a lot of questions at the flattening the curve, whether it's a good or not, whatever. It seems like it's working. And we know more than we knew 3 weeks ago. Not to mention a month ago, where there was all this discussion, well, this has mutated and all the stuff. No, there are many things that we don't know, but every day we know more and more and more things. So I would say to people, you know, hang in there. Every Monday when we meet with the friends here, I think next week the discussion we're gonna have is how better off we are from last week, and that's how it's gonna work. And you know, I have to say that personally, these events give me a lot of kind of strength. Last week's event was also kind of an intellectual awakening. Like, no, you know, this is something that you still need to be intellectually active. You can't say, oh, I'm not gonna read any news or whatever. And so I think every week is going to be better.
Well, yeah, that was actually going to be my optimistic note, is that while we are confined to our homes, we do have these discussions 3 times a week, every Monday and Wednesday and Saturday. And this Wednesday, it's not posted yet on the London Ayn Rand meetup page. It'll be there soon. But Wednesday at 7, we have Dr. Andrew Bernstein, who I mentioned earlier, and we'll have parody rapper and YouTube sensation Rucka Ali, who we had over on Saturday as well. And the topic for that will be rationality and humor. So we are, we'll try to be as upbeat for that as possible. And I want to thank our both of our fantastic speakers and everybody who joined. And see you on Wednesday.